Carol Quigley, Tragedy Hope, Chapter 20. The period of stabilization, 1922 to 1930. As soon as the war was finished, governments began to turn their attention to the problem of restoring the pre-war financial system, since the essential element in that system was believed to be gold standard with its stable exchanges. This movement was called stabilization. Because of their eagerness to restore the pre-war financial situation, the quote experts closed their eyes to the tremendous changes which had resulted from the war. These changes were so great in production, in commerce, and in financial habits that any effort to restore the pre-war conditions or even stabilize on the gold standard was impossible and inadvisable. Instead of seeking a financial system adapted to the new economic and commercial world which had emerged from the war, the experts tried to ignore this world and establish a financial system which looked superficially as much like the pre-war system as possible. This system, however, was not the pre-war system, neither was it adapted to the new economic conditions. When the experts began to have vague glimmerings of this last fact, they did not begin to modify their goals, but insisted on the same goals, and voiced incantations and exhortations against the existing conditions which made the attainment of their goals impossible. These changed economic conditions could not be controlled or exorcised by incantations. They were basically not results of the war at all, but normal outcomes of the economic development of the world in the 19th century. All that the war had done was to speed up the rate of this development. The economic changes, which in 1925 made it so difficult to restore the financial system of 1914, were already discernible in 1890 and clearly evident by 1910. The chief item in these changes was the decline of Britain. What had happened was that the Industrial Revolution was spreading beyond Britain to Europe and the United States, and by 1910 to South America and Asia. As a result, these areas became less dependent on Britain for manufactured goods, less eager to sell their raw materials and food products to her, and became her competitors, both in selling to and in buying from those colonial areas to which industrialism had not yet spread. By 1914, Britain's supremacy as financial center, as commercial market, as creditor, as a merchant shipper, was being threatened. A less obvious threat arose from long-run shifts in demand shifts from the products of heavy industry to the products of more highly specialized branches of production like chemicals, from cereals to fruits and dairy products, from cotton and wool to silk and rayon, from leather to rubber, and so on. These changes presented Britain with a fundamental choice, either to yield her supremacy in the world or reform her industrial and commercial system to cope with the new conditions. The latter was difficult because Britain had allowed her industrial system to become lopsided under the influence of free trade and international division of labor. Over half the employed persons in Britain were engaged in the manufacture of textiles and ferrous metals. Textiles accounted for over one-third of her exports, and textiles, along with iron and steel, for over one-half. At the same time, newer industrial nations, Germany, the United States, and Japan, were growing rapidly, with industrial systems better adapted to the trend of the times. And these were also cutting deeply into Britain's supremacy in merchant shipping. At this critical stage in Britain's development, the World War occurred. This had a double result as far as this subject is concerned. It, it forced Britain to postpone indefinitely any reform of her industrial system to adjust it to more modern trends, and it speeded up the development of these trends so that what might have occurred in 20 years was done instead in 5. In the period 1910 to 1920, Britain's merchant fleet fell by 6% in number of vessels, while that of the United States went up 57%, that of Japan up 130%, and that of the Netherlands up 58%. Her position as the world's greatest creditor was lost to the United States, and a large quantity of good foreign credits were replaced by a smaller amount of poorer risks. In addition, she became a debtor to the United States to the amount of over $4 billion. The change in the positions of the two countries can be summarized briefly. The war changed the position of the United States in respect of the rest of the world from that of a debtor owing about $3 billion to that of a creditor owed $4 billion. This does not include intergovernmental debts of about $10 billion owed to the United States as a result of the war. At the same time, Britain's position changed from a creditor owed about $18 billion to a creditor owed about $13.5 billion. In addition, Britain was owed about $8 billion in war debts from her allies and an unknown sum in reparations from Germany, and owed to the United States war debts of well over $4 billion. Most of these war debts and reparations were sharply reduced after 1920, but the net result for Britain was a drastic change in her position in respect to the United States. The basic economic organization of the world was modified in other ways. As a result of the war, the old organization of relatively free commerce was replaced by a situation in which a larger number of countries sought economic self-sufficiency by placing restrictions on commerce. In addition, productive capacity in both agriculture and industry had been increased by the artificial demand of the war period to a degree far beyond the ability of normal domestic demand to buy the products of that capacity. And finally, the more backward areas of Europe and the world had been industrialized to a greater degree and were unwilling to fall back to a position in which they would obtain industrial products from Britain, Germany, or the United States in return for their raw materials and food. This refusal was made more painful for both sides by the fact that these backward areas had increased their outputs of raw materials and food so greatly that the total could hardly have been sold, even if they had been willing to buy all their industrial products from their pre-war sources. These pre-war sources, in turn, had increased their industrial capacity so greatly that the product could hardly have been sold if they had been able to recapture entirely all their pre-war markets. The result was a situation where all countries were eager to sell and reluctant to buy, and sought to achieve these mutually irreconcilable ends by setting up subsidies and bounties on exports, tariffs and restrictions on imports, with disastrous results on world trade. The only sensible solution to this problem of excessive productive capacity would have been a substantial rise in domestic standards of living, but this would have required a fundamental reapportionment of the national income so that claims to the product of the excess capacity would go to those masses eager to consume rather than continue to go to the minority desiring to save. Such a reform was rejected by the ruling groups in both advanced and backward countries, so that this solution was reached only to a relatively small degree in relatively few countries, chiefly the United States and Germany in the period 1925 to 1929. Changes in the basic productive and commercial organization of the world in the period 1914 to 1919 were made more difficult to adjust by other less tangible changes in financial practices and business psychology. The spectacular post-war inflation seen in Eastern Europe had intensified the traditional fear of inflation among bankers. In an effort to stop rises in prices which might become inflationary, bankers after 1919 increasingly sought to sterilize gold when it flowed into their country. That is, they sought to set it aside so that it did not become part of the monetary system. As a result, the unbalance of trade which had initiated the flow of gold was not counteracted by price changes. Trade and prices remained unbalanced, and gold continued to flow. Somewhat similar was a spreading fear of decreasing gold reserves, so that when gold began to flow out of a country as a result of an unfavorable balance of international payments, bankers increasingly sought to hinder the flow by restrictions on gold exports. With such actions, the unfavorable balance of trade continued, and other countries were inspired to take retaliatory actions. The situation was also disturbed by political fears and by the military ambitions of certain countries, since these frequently resulted in a desire for self-sufficiency, autarky, such as could be obtained only by use of tariffs, subsidies, quotas, and trade controls. Somewhat related to this was the widespread increase in feelings of economic, political, and social insecurity. This gave rise to flights of capital, that is, to panic transfers of holdings, seeking a secure spot regardless of economic return. Moreover, the situation was disturbed by the arrival in the foreign exchange market of a very large number of relatively ignorant speculators. In the period before 1914, speculators in foreign exchange had been a small group of men whose activities were based on long experience with the market and had a stabilizing effect on it. After 1919, large numbers of persons with neither knowledge nor experience began to speculate in foreign exchange. Subject to the influence of rumors, hearsay, and mob panic, their activities had a very disturbing effect on the markets. Finally, within each country, the decline in competition arising from the growth of labor unions, cartels, monopolies, and so on, made prices less responsive to flows of gold or exchange in the international markets, and as a result, such flows did not set into motion those forces which would equalize prices between countries, curtail flows of gold, and balance flows of goods. As a result of all these factors, the system of international payments, which had worked so beautifully before 1914, worked only haltingly after that date, and practically ceased to work at all after 1930. The chief cause of these factors was that neither goods nor money obeyed purely economic forces and did not move as formally to the areas in which each was most valuable. The chief result was a complete maldistribution of gold, a condition which became acute after 1928 and which by 1933 had forced most countries off the gold standard. Modifications of productive and commercial organization and of financial practices made it almost impossible after 1919 to restore the financial system of 1914. Yet this is what was attempted. Instead of seeking to set up a new financial organization adapted to the modified economic organization, bankers and politicians insisted that the old pre-war system should be restored. These efforts were concentrated in a determination to restore the gold standard as it had existed in 1914. In addition to these pragmatic goals, the powers of financial capitalism had another far-reaching aim, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. This system was to be controlled in a feudalist fashion by the central banks of the world acting in concert, by secret agreements arrived at in frequent private meetings and conferences. The apex of this system was to be the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, a private bank owned and controlled by the world's central banks, which were themselves private corporations. Each central bank, in the hands of men like Montague Norman of the Bank of England, Benjamin Strong of the New York Federal Reserve Bank, Charles Rist of the Bank of France, and Hjalmar Schacht of the Reichsbank, sought to dominate its government by its ability to control treasury loans, to manipulate foreign exchanges, to influence the level of economic activity in the country, and to influence cooperative politicians by subsequent economic rewards in the business world. In each country, the power of the central bank rested largely on its control of credit and money supply. In the world as a whole, the power of the central bankers rested very largely on their control of loans and gold flows. In the final days of the system, these central bankers were able to mobilize resources to assist each other through the BIS, where payments between central banks could be made by bookkeeping adjustments between the accounts which the central banks of the world kept there. The BIS, as a private institution, was owned by the 7 chief central banks and was operated by the heads of these, who together formed its governing board. Each of these kept a substantial deposit at the BIS and periodically settled payments among themselves, and thus between the major countries of the world, by bookkeeping, in order to avoid shipments of gold. They made agreements on all the major financial problems of the world, as well as on many of the economic and political problems, especially in reference to loans, payments, and the economic future of the chief areas of the globe. The BIS is generally regarded as the apex of the structure of financial capitalism, whose remote origins go back to the creation of the Bank of England in 1694 and the Bank of France in 1803. As a matter of fact, its establishment in 1929 was rather an indication that the centralized world financial system of 1914 was in decline. It was set up rather to remedy the decline of London as the world's financial center by providing a mechanism by which a world with three chief financial centers in London, New York, and Paris could still operate as one. The BIS was a vain effort to cope with the problems arising from the growth of a number of centers. It was intended to be the world cartel of ever-growing national financial powers by assembling the nominal heads of these national financial centers. The commander-in-chief of the world system of banking control was Montague Norman, governor of the Bank of England, who was built up by the private bankers to a position where he was regarded as an oracle in all matters of government and business. In government, the power of the Bank of England was a considerable restriction on political action as early as 1819, but an effort to break this power by a modification of the bank's charter in 1844 failed. In 1852, Gladstone, then Chancellor of the Exchequer and later Prime Minister, declared, "The hinge of the whole situation was this: the government itself was not to be a substantive power in matters of finance, but was to leave the money power supreme and unquestioned." End quote.